Well, welcome to Lecture 3 of Psych 1040, Experimental Design. And we are going to be focusing mainly on experiments today, how researchers go about designing experiments and some of the issues they face when they are trying to design an experiment. We'll focus more in the next lecture on survey design. Now, some of these decisions that I'm talking about today could also apply to what happens when you conduct a survey or do a quasi-experiment, so keep that in mind. So it's just kind of a nice way that we'll just focus on all of these issues by looking at how experiments are designed. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how an experimenter might choose their design and then how they choose their sample. Then we'll talk about how they pick their independent variable and how they choose to have an operational definition of it, manipulate the independent variable, as well as how they choose their dependent variables. Finally, the rest of the lecture will focus on some really big concerns that all researchers face in terms of the threats to their internal validity of their experiment, as well as the threats to external validity of their studies.
As I talk about some of these decisions that researchers have to think about when they design experiments, I thought I'd go ahead and pick a real-life experiment just to use as our example of how these decisions could be made. And what I'm going to talk about is something that comes from the movement called positive psychology. And in this work in positive psychology, there's been a lot of work on the effect of what happens when people express gratitude. So this is really inspired by research by Marty Seligman, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who's really who spearheaded or is the father of the positive psychology movement. Positive psychology has really been focused on how to improve people's well-being, to make them happier, to give them a more sense of purpose in their everyday life, that kind of thing. And so there's a lot of different kinds of positive emotions that it focuses on and a lot of different ways that it talks about the way that we could have more positive feelings in our lives. And one of the hypotheses that come from this theoretical framework is this idea that when someone does something for us, if we can express gratitude towards them, the simple act of thanking somebody for something actually makes us feel better, that it actually helps with our well-being, that we've expressed some gratitude to that person. So let's go now and look at some of these decisions, as I said, that we're going to talk about, choices that face researchers. So in designing research to test this or any kind of theory, we have to make a number of decisions. Among these things, we have to select a methodology and who our participants are. We have to figure out what the independent variable is going to be and the dependent variable. We have to have a means of establishing that the effects of manipulating the independent variable are unlikely to have occurred by chance. And we have to have a criterion for establishing that these effects probably haven't occurred by chance. Now, D and E are really statistical issues. And so these are things that we'll start talking about from the 5th lecture on, when we get much more into things like p-values and so on. So this is going back to some of the logic behind hypothesis testing. So I won't really talk about D and E today. We're going to really focus on A, B, and C. All right, let's take that first question about how we choose the methodology and our participant sample. So broadly speaking, if we choose experiments, then we're probably more likely to select what we call normal participants. And you'll notice I put that in quotes there. That is, usually people in psychology choose normal participants like first-year psychology undergraduates or other people who have characteristics that are relevant to our theory. Now, in this case, the theory has to do with the idea that when we thank people, we feel better. So a large number of people in the world are going to have these characteristics that can be tested by this theory. So it's probably not so important whom we pick, because we think that the theory says that basically everybody benefits from expressing gratitude to something else. Let's see how Seligman in their study, the study that they published in 2005 on gratitude, how they looked at this. They say here, we recruited a convenience sample from among visitors to the website created for Seligman's 2002 book, Authentic Happiness, by creating a link called Happiness Exercises. The study was described on the site as an opportunity to help test new exercises designed to increase happiness. So over the course of approximately 1 month, they recruited 577 adult participants, 42% male, 58% female. Almost 2/3 of these participants were between the ages of 35 and 54. Of the participants, 39% had a degree from a 4-year college, 27% had some graduate school education, Notably, only 4% of the participants did not have education or vocational training after high school, another limit on the generalizability of our findings. Consistent with their reported levels of education, approximately 3/4 of the participants classified their incomes as average or above average, and the sample was largely white. So you can see in this case that the sample is really people who happen to come across this website and probably people who are reading Seligman's book about happiness. So they're not necessarily the most representative sample of the entire world, but they should be people who have this ability to express gratitude. And according to theory, if you express gratitude, you should feel happier, have a better sense of well-being. So the question might be then, why do people just use these convenient samples? So convenient samples anytime where it's just easy to collect some data. And the most common answer is that in conducting experiments, we are not attempting to generalize from the experimental population directly to the world in general, but rather we do that via a theory. So we're going to try to generalize our findings because our theory says that we think it applies to all people, or whoever the people are that have this characteristics. So we use experiments to validate a theory, and then we apply the theory to the real world. Not to do so is to be guilty of what's called naive empiricism. So naive empiricism means that I'm basically going to take my findings and try to generalize it to the world without regard of theory. Another way to put this is the way that I have it in this drawing. So if I have my experimental findings and I go back to see how does this confirm my theory or not, then I use my theory then to generalize to the rest of the population. So of course my theory was probably there at the beginning to help me design the study, to make my hypotheses. So when I've conducted my experiment, I can go back to that theory, and then the theory says, hey, people who are expressing gratitude are more likely to feel good. So I can generalize that to anybody who expresses gratitude, they should feel good. If again, I didn't talk about a theory at all, and I just took my findings from my experiment that I ran with whomever I could get in my convenience sample, and then tried to generalize it without regard to the theory, that would be called naive empiricism. So we don't want to do the thing on the bottom. We always want to base our research on some kind of theory. Now, I'll note, though, that in the next lecture, we're going to be talking about surveys. And very often in surveys, it's just not generally true that they're actually trying to generalize to the entire population via a theory. So the same is not generally true for theories, which typically are trying to attempt to identify real-world patterns. So the reason why they're conducting the survey in the first place is they're hoping to understand what the whole population thinks. So it's more important that survey samples are representative of the general populations in which researchers are interested in. So if I'm interested in, for example, in whether or not people who are bothered by aircraft noise are more likely to vote for a particular party, or whether people who get the flu or COVID or whatever are going to be more likely to have more dogs, whatever it is, I'm going to go ahead and try to then sample my population to best represent those characteristics that I'm actually interested in studying. And so I wouldn't necessarily be interested in validating a theory. But we'll talk more about that at the next lecture. Now, remember too that sometimes we can't actually manipulate our independent variable. So if the researcher thinks it would be too hard to manipulate the participant's gratitude, she may decide to identify like two subgroups, people who are generally high or generally low in gratitude. So instead of like actually experimentally having people express gratitude, you just say, are you a person who does gratitude on a regular basis, or somebody who never says thank you? And then I have here, what's the problem with that kind of research? If I can't manipulate the independent variable, what's the problem? The problem is, as I mentioned in the last lecture, of confounding. We could have a confound, that if I don't actually manipulate my independent variable, there could be another variable that completely is related to high and low gratitude. For example, perhaps people who are generally low in gratitude are more intelligent, less imaginative, they have unpleasant parents, they never got any Christmas presents, or whatever. So it could be any of these other factors that could really be the difference between people who are high and low in gratitude, and I wouldn't know because I'm not experimentally manipulating it when I see effects on the dependent variable. One solution to this problem, if you can't directly manipulate the IV, is to try to do something that's called matching. And this is a very common procedure in clinical research because, for example, you might want to take people who have depression versus people who are not depressed, or you want to have people that are in a one kind of treatment versus people in another kind of treatment. And what you do is you try to match them on as many characteristics as you can. So maybe if you're looking at depression versus non-depression, you try to match them on intelligence. So you get somebody who has an IQ of 120 in the depressed group, you try to find somebody in the control group who also has an IQ of 120. Or that their parents treated them the same, or whatever it was. You try to find other variables to match them on so there isn't this confound. But although that sounds promising, matching is just never as effective as means of removing these sort of differences as using randomization, when you can truly do an experiment and randomly assign people to the different conditions. So going back to choosing our independent variable, in essence, the goal in selecting an independent variable is to identify that variable which approximates most closely to the theoretical variable of interest. In practice, this is often much harder than it sounds. We spent a lot of time in my own research group really brainstorming about how to manipulate that independent variable. So if you go back to our example, the central theoretical variable is expressing gratitude. So how can we manipulate this directly? How would you go about making sure that some participants are randomly assigned to a condition where they express gratitude and other people are in a condition where they don't? Well, we can look to see how Seligman did this in 2005. They had two different conditions. So in the control condition, they called the placebo control exercise, participants were asked to write about their early memories every night for 1 week. But in the experimental condition, the gratitude condition, participants were given 1 week to write and then deliver a letter of gratitude in person to someone who had been especially kind to them, but had never been properly thanked. So that's how Seligman and his colleagues decided to manipulate this independent variable, to look at expressions of gratitude in the experimental condition and then have a way of comparing that in the control condition. Notice they could have done this in lots of different ways. They could have just said things like, I want you to go ahead and send an email to somebody in the next 24 hours in the gratitude condition and thank them. Or they could have given them a phone call or whatever it was. There's lots of different ways to have an operational definition of expressing gratitude, right? And the key thing is that they wanted to make sure the control was as similar to the experimental condition as they could without actually having them express gratitude. So they had them do something every night for a week as well and write about things so that they would be like sort of reflective at the end of the week. So here's sort of a reenactment of the Seligman et al. Experiment. This is a YouTube video that looks back at how Seligman et al. Did this in their first versions of their study. So this gratitude research has been done for a while. So I want to go ahead and show you how they did it in 1992. Again, this is sort of a reenactment of how they did gratitude.
Shut up.
What? Wait.
I was going to be so embarrassed.
What makes you happy? Having fun? Hanging out with friends? Delicious food? Making money? Well, consider this. Psychologists have scientifically proven that one of the greatest contributing factors to overall happiness in your life is how much gratitude you show. Yeah? Think about that. Go ahead and marinate on it for a second. You can thank me later if you want. It'll make you feel better according to this study. You go ahead and click on it and read it if you want. Or you can keep watching because we read it and we thought it might be fun to test out for ourselves. We gathered a selection of volunteers to act as our subjects. First, we gave them a test. They didn't know what we were looking for, but it gave us a pretty good idea of their current level of happiness. We asked them to close their eyes and think of somebody who was really influential in their life, somebody who did something really amazing or important for them. We had them write down as much as they could about why this person was so important. Now, a lot of them thought at this point the experiment was over, until we really put them on the spot and tried to get them to call that person and read what they wrote about them. Thank you, Jessica. We're going to have you call your mother. So who is that right person for you?
Person is my sister, Erica.
We're going to give Erica a call.
Okay.
Who'd you end up picking?
Friend of mine, Craig Ains.
Her name is Dora.
My college accounting instructor.
Really? Mm-hmm. Is this somebody you're still in touch with today?
No, I'm assuming that he's passed on.
That's a shame.
To the great beyond.
You up for it?
Yes.
What would you say if we called up Dora?
Oh, we can try, but she lives in Britain.
In Britain?
I don't know a number by heart, dude. This is awful.
That's fine. I don't know my mom's number by heart.
If it's true that those who are going on are looking down on us, maybe he read my chicken scratch.
Hey, sweetheart.
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah.
You got a second? Where you at, in the hotel?
I am. I'm in the hotel. You scared me when you asked if I had a second if something's wrong.
No, I'm on this little TV show, and they told me to talk about the person that influenced me the most, and I picked you, and they're making me call you. They're making me call you.
Oh, wonderful!
Hi, you've reached Craig. I'm not here right now.
At the tone, please record your message.
Oh, come on.
Hello?
Hi,
Hi.
Erica. It's me.
All right, so I got to read you this paragraph. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead,
All right.
sweetheart.
All right. The person that influenced me the most would be my mother, Marlo Dawson. She is a single mother of 2. She is a very hard worker and dedicated to her family.
Hey, Craig. This is Loie. This is going to be a funny little voicemail, so I hope you enjoy it.
I'm so sorry for calling you at 4 o'clock in the morning.
I have to read this to you, okay? And you can't say anything, or I don't know. You can respond, but I probably will just keep going. Okay?
Is everything okay?
Yes, but I have to read this out loud to you.
The person who has had the biggest impact on my life outside of Jesus Christ, who is responsible for my existence, was my college accounting instructor. He had a joy and enthusiasm for his job like no other teacher I have ever known.
I love her to death, and she keeps me going with positive talk. She is a woman that knows what she wants and won't give up until it is achieved.
Oh, something. I don't know what. I'm about to cry because that's so beautiful. I have to say that's just wonderful.
I first met Craig on an independent feature film set in Whitefish, Montana. I recently have been sending Craig a lot of positive thoughts as he suffered a series of health problems. Despite his medical problems, he's continued to work and take pleasure in the small things in life, like sitting quietly with his wife Janine on the porch. Erica is my older sister and my best friend. Sometimes it even feels like we are twins. She's my #1 fan and my #1 supporter. She makes me happy because despite all my mistakes and my decisions, she still loves me no matter what.
Your friendship is everything. And you are one of the most important person in my life.
Even when she has a kid and many children, I will love her more than her kids. Okay, maybe not. I will never forget when she flew 3,000 miles at the drop of a phone call to save me from a breakup.
And being blessed by having a son like you. I love you.
Bye.
Why did you do that?
I don't know because they made me do it.
Thank you for picking up. Bye, sweetie.
And then they're like, here, you're going to write this letter. And then I wrote like this whole long ass letter, which, I like don't write. And then all of a sudden they're like, hey, guess what? Now we're going to call her and you're going to read her this letter. And I was like, what the
Before we let them go, we gave our subjects one more happiness test. Now, we mixed up and rephrased the questions so they didn't know they were taking the same test twice. For those who took the time to actually write something down but couldn't make the phone call for whatever reason, we saw happiness increase between 2 and 4%. Good, but not exactly mind-blowing. Now, for those who actually picked up the phone and personally expressed their gratitude, we saw increases between 4 and 19%. So either way, expressing your gratitude will make you a happier person. But you want to know something really interesting? The person who experienced the biggest jump in happiness was the least happy person who walked in the door. What does that mean? That means if you're having a particularly tough time, trying this out will more likely have a greater impact on you. Trust me, I'm in a lab coat. In fact, while you're at it, film it and upload it to us, and we'll do something awesome with it. I'm Julian, and this has been The Science of Happiness.
Open cake, subscribe.
Okay, so that gives you, a reenactment of what Seligman's research has been like. And as I said, in the 2005 paper, they went and had people work on this for a week, and then they went and visited them. In an early version of this kind of research, they did do what you just saw in the video, where they had people make phone calls. But either way, they just generally find this effect that actually makes people feel happier after they've done it versus people that are in the control group. So again, going back to how you choose the independent variable, there's a lot of thinking that has to go behind it. And one of the things that you're going to want to do is actually make sure that you are doing what you think you're doing. Are you actually making people express gratitude? So it's often desirable to include what's called a manipulation check. And so, for instance, after you've gone ahead and asked somebody to make that phone call or to go ahead and talk to somebody, you could ask them to rate, to what extent do you feel grateful right now? Now, if you really have made them feel grateful by having them express gratitude, you would expect that they'd rate this pretty high on this scale compared to people who are in the condition where they're just remembering something from their childhood. And in Seligman et al. In 2005, they do mention this. They say, in addition, participants answered a manipulation check question to assess whether they had in fact completed the exercises instructed during the relevant time period, scored as yes or no. So their independent variable was checked by just asking them, did you actually go and say something to somebody else and thank them, for what they had done for you? Yes or no. And so that's another kind of manipulation check. But the point of these manipulation checks is that you want to have a way to measure that the independent variable was actually manipulated. All right, so that's the independent variable. Now let's move to the dependent variable, the dependent variable. So let's say that a researcher, for example, was interested in alcohol consumption, on how it affects road fatalities. And you might say, well, the simplest thing to do is just have people drink alcohol or not, and then have them drive, and then you can measure to see whether or not they killed people. But that would be kind of an unethical approach to doing your research. So one way to get around that would be to have people come to the laboratory, have some people drink alcohol and some people not drink alcohol, and then perhaps have them do a reaction time study where they press buttons to colors of lights, and then you could look to see how much alcohol they consumed affects their ability to respond to changing conditions. So the point here is that, again, just like with the selection of the independent variable, the selection of the dependent variables is often complicated by practical constraints. So in this study, we have the issue of the Seligman et al. Interested in looking at how happy people feel. And there's probably different ways you could do it. Now, you could watch that video and you could see right there in the participant's face whether or not they looked happy. But you couldn't really do that in Seligman's study because the people were actually doing this as an experiment online or on a survey. Like, that is that they weren't actually there in person. They were out there in the world and then answering some questions. So what they did in that study was they went ahead and asked the participants to rate how happy they felt at different times. So before they had actually done the experiment, after they had gone ahead and done the expression of gratitude, 1 week later, 1 month later, 3 months later, and 6 months later. And you can see that the 80 participants in this study who did do the gratitude visit, they just generally were happier at the post-test. There was a significant difference there in the post-test where they were happier than the people in the placebo control. A week later, you can still see that everybody's happiness is a little bit lower than it was last week, but you can still see that the gratitude participants have a higher rating of happiness than the people in the placebo control. And that was true for even a month later. But when we get to 3 months or 6 months later, that one gratitude visit wasn't sufficient to keep the happiness levels up. So we might think about the dependent variable in another way. Let's say, for example, that I think that gratitude, expressing gratitude, makes people feel less depressed. They're going to feel happier overall. And so what I do, instead of measuring how happy they feel, what I do is I measure the number of times that they go and see a psychologist. How many participants in the gratitude condition go see a psychologist? And the point is that if I've really reduced their depression, then those people who express gratitude that 1 week probably would not go and see a psychologist later on in their life. They'd be happier, right? Well, if you did that, your experiment would probably be bound to fail. And the reason is because very few people are actually going to go see a psychologist anyway, just by chance. And so you'd have very few people in either condition who were going to go see a psychologist. So because you had so little sensitivity about this that you couldn't really measure how happy or sad they were by just waiting to see who went to see a psychologist, you probably would end up supporting the null hypothesis, using that as your dependent variable, and therefore infer that the independent variable, expressing gratitude, had no impact on the dependent variable, the number of people who actually went off to see a psychologist. So this is one of the trade-offs, one of the decisions we have to think about when we're choosing our dependent variable, that there's this relevance sensitivity trade-off. The more sensitive that a DV is to changes in the independent variable, the less relevant it may become to the dramatic real-world phenomenon in which we are interested in. So by asking people just how happy they are on a scale might not seem very real-world-like, but maybe seeing whether or not people go and see a psychologist is. But the problem is seeing a psychologist is not a very sensitive way of measuring our dependent variable. So we probably wouldn't actually be able to see anything happening on the independent variable. So that's the kind of thing that we kind of think about back and forth as we choose our dependent variables. Do we have something that's really relevant and of interest? And also, could it be that it's sensitive to manipulations of the independent variable? All right, so there we've talked about how we choose our sample, how we choose to do an experiment, and then how we look at our independent and our dependent variable. It's time now to think about internal versus external validity. So validity in psychology refers to the question, how valid or good is this study? So that's what we mean by validity. It's a judgment of how good the study is. It is, relatively speaking, a subjective judgment. And the more that you become an expert in doing research, the more you can have a stronger validation of your theory, of your judgment about how good it is. So it kind of takes training to be able to know how good a study actually is. But a couple of the main things that we think about are things like the internal validity versus the external validity. So internal validity has to do with how well does this study really investigate what it's supposedly studying. So internal validity is how well does this study really investigate what it's supposedly studying. They say that they're studying how gratitude affects how happy you are. Is that true? Did they really show that in this study? Is it a good study in that sense? External validity has to do with how well does this study's findings extend to the world outside of the study. So how well can this be generalized to other situations and other people? That's external validity. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about what are called threats to validity, things that have an impact on how good the study is, okay? So these are called threats. So the threats here are not like scary threats. They're threats in terms of if you're trying to have a really good study, these are things you'd have to consider because they could mess up your study and not make it so good. And because we have internal validity and external validity, we can look at these threats in the same way. We can look at threats to internal validity first, and then we'll look at threats to external validity. So, threats to internal validity. I want you to think of an experiment in which a researcher makes an observation. For example, that patients are anxious. Okay, so their first observation is O1, observation 1. And then they carry out some experimental manipulation, like the treatment. Maybe they give them anxiety therapy. So the X would be the treatment, the experimental manipulation. And then they make another observation, O2, to see what the effect of the treatment was. So this is a very common way that we think about diagramming experiments. So O1 is the first observation we make, the first time we measure the dependent variable. X refers to, again, the treatment, the experimental manipulation. And then O2 would be a second observation, a second time we measure the dependent variable. And so you could represent the design of the study as follows. You could say O1, X, O2. And that kind of tells us the time order, right? So O1 comes first, then we manipulate something, and then we have O2. All right. With that notation in mind, you'll see it'll come up a few more times in this lecture. Threats to internal validity lead researchers to interpret the effects they obtain incorrectly. So this is why we're concerned about them. That if you have such threats in your study, they're inherent in the way you designed your study, then that means that we can't really interpret your effects very well. Campbell and Stanley were two noted psychology researchers, and in 1963, they wrote a little book in which they identified 7 main threats to internal validity. Okay, so there are 7 main threats to internal validity to think about when we're designing our studies. The first one's called maturation. So maturation is during the study, psychological changes occur in the participants. This also could be due to practice or fatigue effects. So something is happening between O1 and O2 where the participants just naturally getting older, or they're feeling fatigued, or something happens to them in terms of time. Then we have history. History is events other than the experimental treatment, influences the results. We have a threat called testing or reactivity. This is exposure to a pretest or other assessment influences the performance on the post-test. So just being in the experiment, being tested, being measured is affecting the participant. Instrumentation is testing instruments or conditions are inconsistent. For instance, the pretest and the post-test are not equivalent, therefore creating an illusory change in the performance. Then we have statistical threat to internal validity. This is where the scores of the participants are very high or very low, and they'll tend to regress what's called towards the statistical mean during retesting. Then we have participant threat to internal validity, which is when we have systematic differences that exist in the participants' characteristics between the two treatment groups. And finally, something that's called experimental threat to internal validity, where we get some sort of attrition that could bias the results. So I'm going to take these 7 things now and talk about them in more detail, these 7 threats to internal validity. Let's take the first one, maturation. So again, the idea about maturation is we measured our participant, we waited a little while, then we went ahead and had them be exposed to our experimental manipulation, and then we measured them again. And what we might find is that there's a difference between O1 and O2 simply because the participants in this long-term study got older. Maybe this was the beginning of year 11 in high school, and there was a big change that happens in the maturation of their emotions during that particular year. And so it's not because I did something to them in the experiment, it's actually just because time passed over the year and they changed. And also, this could happen in a short-term experiment, like just something that happens in the lab in a half an hour, where the participants get practice at the task they are doing and they become tired or bored as a result of repetition. So this could lead to practice effects and fatigue effects because they get really good at the task or they get really tired of doing the task. So this would be a problem where we have like an experiment that there's lots of work to be done. Like maybe they have to keep pressing a button for 25 or 30 minutes and they start getting tired. And so now the way that they respond near the end of the experiment is quite different from the way they respond at the beginning of the experiment. And it's really because of fatigue. All right, that was the first threat to internal validity. Now let's look at another one. This is history. So the idea here is that something has happened during the course of this experiment where the participants changed, but it had nothing to do with the experimenter's manipulation. It had to do with changes that actually occurred in the real world. This could be things like, for instance, that maybe during the study that maybe had to do with health, that there was a pandemic or that people got colds or something like that. So something happened in the real world that actually affected people's concerns about their health. So throughout the experiment, things are changing here mainly because history is changing. Something's happening out there in the real world that's having an impact on the participants' responses. More subtly would be that features of the experimental situation itself could change and that these testing effects could be responsible for changes between O1 and O2. It could be, for instance, the experimenter gets tired during the experiment, or the experimenter went and had some coffee and by the end of the experiment they're talking really fast, and so when they measure O2, talking really fast, they get a different kind of response. The next threat to internal validity is called testing or reactivity. And this is when one particularly important change relates to the fact that the participants already have experienced being observed before, like at the pre-test or the O1. So that is, like, for example, let's say when they first come into the testing situation, I measure how happy they are. And they say, oh, I'm on a 1 to 10 scale, I'm a 9. And then about 15 minutes have passed, I've done my experimental manipulation, I have them write a letter of gratitude, and then again say, how happy are you? And they remember the fact that they were told that they said that they were 9 on a 1 to 10 scale, so they put 9 again because they want to look consistent. So you see, their response then at the second time they're being measured is being affected by the fact that they were already measured first, that something happened at the pretest. So sometimes people just get rid of the pretest altogether. They don't ask them what it was like at O1, and they just go ahead and have them do the experiment and then look at O2 at the second time, or the time after they've been manipulated with the experimental variable, and then see if there's a difference between the different conditions. It could also just be that another threat to internal validity here, a general threat here is this testing or reactivity, is that they just are being different because they're being observed. That is, they showed up to an experiment, they know they're part of an experiment, and so they're not acting the way they normally act because they're just being observed. This actually goes back to an old phenomenon known as the Hawthorne Effect, this effect of being observed and seeing changes in people's being observed that way. And what's cool about the Hawthorne Effect is that it actually has a connection to UQ psychology. And here is actually the first lectures that we had at UQ. There were 7 of them. And these 7 lectures, you can see what their different topics were. You can even recognize some of their names if you've been on the UQ campus and recognize some of the buildings. But the guy there in the upper right corner, Elton Mayo, it says here he was a lecturer in philosophy. He'd actually gotten an honors degree and a master's degree in psychology and was our first real psychology lecturer. So Elton Mayo, who lived from 1880 to 1949, was actually one of our first UQ lecturers and also UQ's first psychology professor. Back then, he was, though, in the philosophy department. So he was actually a psychology professor in the philosophy department. But he didn't stay that long. In the early 1920s, he left UQ for the US, and he ended up at the Harvard Business School at the end of the 1920s. While he was there at the Harvard Business School, he had a graduate assistant named Fritz Roethlisberger, and Fritz Roethlisberger and he conducted a study known as the Hawthorne Studies at a telephone factory in Chicago. So there was this Western Electric company in Chicago, and they had been tasked to make new telephones. And so these telephones are being produced at a high number of telephones per week, and they're creating all these telephones. And what the company wanted to know is, how can we actually increase their productivity? How can we get the workers there in Chicago to produce more telephones? So Roethlisberger and Mayo and some other colleagues were looking at different variables that would increase the productivity of the workers, make them happier. And one of the things that they looked at, for instance, was just turning on the lights, making the lights brighter, that kind of thing, or having them have a break room, take longer breaks, have some input in a meeting, all that kind of thing. And they would always do these studies very carefully, where they'd have like a control condition where, like, for example, there was a group of people who didn't get the new lights, and there was another group that did get the lights, and then they compared their productivity between the experimental group and the control group. So while they were looking at improving all these working conditions, all the participants, whether they were in the experimental or the control conditions, showed increased productivity and happiness, which was sort of a mess for the experiment, because the experiment research was really trying to say, how can we improve productivity? But even the control group showed that increased productivity and happiness. So it was just like being part of the Hawthorne studies, having these Harvard researchers doing the study itself just increased productivity and happiness without really having any other impact of the independent variable. So that's what we call the Hawthorne effect. It's this idea that participants' behavior changes simply by participating in research. So they come into our study and they don't act the way they normally would because they know they're in an experiment. So that is another kind of this related to this threat here again of reactivity. All right. Then we have another threat to internal validity called instrumentation. And the idea behind instrumentation is that other features of the experiment may also change between the two observations, and these instrumentation effects undermine validity in much the same way. So instrumentation refers to any feature of the experiment related to the collection of the data. For example, who it is collected by. Like maybe there were two different experimenters. One collected the observations before the experiment, and then they changed and had a different experimenter do it for the second part. Or where it was collected. Like maybe you had them fill out the questionnaires in the lab before the experiment began, but at the end of the experiment, they fill out the questionnaires at their homes. And also maybe the questionnaires themselves are different. So the point is that when I'm trying to compare what's happened between the first observation and the second observation as a function of my independent variable, I can't really tell, is it the independent variable that's causing changes here again, or is it because I changed the experimenter and other things like that, which are basically confounds. A statistical threat to internal validity is a more subtle problem that arises when we have an independent variable that's manipulated within subjects. This means that everybody in the study is going to get the conditions in the study, and the participants are selected because of their extremity or peculiarity on the variable of interest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure people over and over and over again, and I'm going to compare the people who are really extreme on some variable. So for example, maybe I pick people who differ in their anxiety. So I got people who are extremely high in anxiety and people who are really low in anxiety, and they keep going to a therapist. And what I might see is something like this. So at baseline, I've got the people at the top are the people who are the most anxious and the people at the bottom who are the least anxious at the baseline. And then what happens is over the course of the experiment, you can see that as they go through this therapist, they're all coming closer and closer to the same value. So at time 2, all 4 groups here actually have about the same level of anxiety. Now, is this because the experimenter has gone ahead and helped those people so much that we're in the high anxious group? Well, actually, the improvement is quite likely to have occurred regardless of whether or not actually any experimental intervention occurred. And this is because of this statistical problem known as regression to the mean. That is, over there on the left at the baseline, the very first time we actually ran the study, you can see that we have 4 very different groups that are really extreme. But what happens is just naturally over time, if you measure something again and again and again, extreme scores become more and more middling, more towards the mean. So this could simply be that as we go from baseline to time 1 to time 2, that the scores themselves are just coming closer to the middle because of regression to the mean, and not because the experimenter has done anything. So this is again just saying that if I go ahead and take really extreme scores at the beginning and then keep measuring them, they'll just naturally kind of come more towards the middle just because they happen to be extreme at the beginning. So it's just a statistical phenomenon, like I said, known as regression to the mean. And that would be another threat then to the internal validity of your study. There's also this one called participant as an internal threat to validity. And this would be effects that arise when participants are assigned to different levels of an independent variable on the basis of some specific criteria, like their age or their score on a particular test. So the problem then is that any differences between the groups on the dependent measures may exist because before the manipulation occurs, because different sorts of people have been selected for the groups just by chance. And so we don't know, again, this is the problem. We could try to do this with matching, but it's just saying that we don't really know that maybe there's some other things that are actually different between the 2 different groups. Finally, what the last threat to internal validity is known as is called experimental or mortality threats. And this is that in the time between any 2 observations, particular people may withdraw from a study. So if I'm doing a study that takes a long time, like I'm going to go ahead and measure people over 3 weeks or a month, I'm going to have people who just withdraw from the study, who quit, who don't come back after the end of my experiment. In fact, in some extreme cases, like in animal and medical studies, this could be because the participants die, which is why they call it sometimes the mortality threat, because people just drop out because of the medicine or they got old or whatever it happens to be. So even in a simple laboratory study done at the University of Queensland, we get mortality effects if I go ahead and wait a couple days between the 2 sessions when I measure them, because some people just never come back. They never do the second part of the experiment, and that would be another threat to internal validity. I don't know if perhaps people are dropping out of the experimental group for different reasons from people who are dropping out of the control group. And so therefore, I might have different effects between my experimental and my control group just because of the way that people dropped out of the study. In fact, in the Seligman study in 2005, they did mention a little bit about mortality. They say here, of the 577 participants who completed the baseline questionnaires, 71% completed all 5 follow-up assessments. Participants who dropped out of the study, they say, did not differ from those who remained on their baseline happiness or depression scores, nor was there differential dropout from the 6 exercises. We include our analyses only those participants who completed all the follow-up questionnaires. So you see what they did is they ended up analyzing to try to see if they could understand if there was any real mortality problems here, that maybe participants who remained were different from the people who were in the control group and so on. And they say here, frankly, that they don't think that they had that kind of problem. So what do we do with these threats to internal validity? How do we try to minimize them? Well, the problem posed by all of these threats to internal validity that Campbell and Stanley mentioned are essentially the same. That is, they all produce systematic differences between different experimental observations over and above anything that's been caused by the manipulation of the independent variable. In fact, all these problems are extremely common in research, and they're actually commonly overlooked, especially when you see journalists and publicity seekers that want to hail some new breakthrough in some kind of study. So this is, again, why we spend so much time thinking about our studies when we design them, then presenting our results in our entire study to other researchers before we maybe publish the paper, having reviewers go through our papers, our research reports to see if we've done everything as best as we can. There's always some place, perhaps, that there's a threat to internal validity, and we often overlook these for particularly really bad studies. So one thing you could do is you could include an additional pre-test and post-test condition, and this control condition involves different participants, but a pre-test and post-test that are identical in every way. So one simple thing to do is always make sure that at the very least, if you're going to go ahead and observe people, then go ahead and do something, then observe them again, is have a control condition where you observe people, you don't do anything to them, and you observe again. And then that way, by having these two conditions, having a control condition and experimental condition, it helps reduce a lot of the threats to internal validity. And then, of course, use random assignment whenever possible. If there's a big enough difference, then this must be then a result of the experimental treatment rather than any of the other factors. So our manipulation of the independent variable, if we used random assignment and we really get a difference between the two groups, we can feel confident because we use random assignment that the independent variable is actually really having an effect on the dependent variable. You see, when we don't use random assignment, then these threats to internal validity are even greater. They're even more of a problem. They're more of a nuisance. And so again, when we can, we try to use random assignment. So I have one more final set of threats here to consider, and these are the threats to external validity. So one of the problems that we have as a threat to external validity is just using a pre-test, post-test design in the first place. That this in itself can threaten external validity. And this is because the effects of testing across the two observations could possibly interact with the experimental manipulation. Knowing that you're going to be tested one time and then being tested again a second time isn't something that happens normally in everyday life. That is, knowing that I was tested the first time and then I'm going to go through this manipulation, then they're going to go ahead and measure me again, could interact with whatever the effects are of my experimental study. And there's more details about this in your textbook if you look at Haslam and McGarty on pages 92 to 93. What they suggest is that you deal with this problem by just getting rid of the first observation so you don't have an O1. This is something I've already alluded to earlier in this lecture, so that there's no pretest for the experimental treatment to react with. So this idea would be that you just have your treatment, then O2, and then you have a control group that just has O2. They don't get the treatment. And so if I see a difference on O2 between the two conditions, I can say it's because of the experimental independent variable, especially again if I've used random assignment. Now, there are other threats to external validity. There's what's called experiments demand characteristics, and this was first identified by Orrin back in 1962. These are cues the experimenter might give to participants about what's expected of them. So this isn't necessarily something conscious that the experimenter is trying to do, but for example, a person may respond to the question, "Are you sure you're anxious?" by saying no when they actually are anxious, because they think that the response no is being demanded of them. So if the experimenter kind of makes it sound like they'd rather have them say no than yes, then maybe the participant would actually say no instead of yes. One solution, by the way, to get around demand characteristics so that your participants can't figure out exactly what it is that you're trying to do in terms of your hypotheses and how they're expected to react is to use what's called a cover story. And a cover story is basically sort of a misleading story about what the experiment is about, so that you hide what the true purpose is, what the true reason is that you're giving them these questions and so on. So for example, if you're really interested in finding out how they think about themselves, you might say that you're just giving them a personality test when you really are trying to actually find out what they think about themselves. So that could also then be concealing the purpose of the experiment from them, so they don't actually know until it's done with. Or you could use what's called a double-blind experiment, which is where you as the researcher don't know what condition they've been assigned to, so that you couldn't actually give them any cues about how they're supposed to respond. Or you could try to employ what are called naive experimenters. These would be research assistants whom you haven't actually told about the hypotheses. So when they're running the experiment, they can't act in a way that helps the experiment work out to the participants, because they don't actually even know what the hypotheses are. So this is a little bit harder to do, though. Like, it means that you have to have people working for you who don't really understand what they're doing, and it wouldn't necessarily be a very fulfilling job to have a naive experimenter. Another threat to all that's related to all this external validity is what's called social desirability concerns. And this is when participants give answers or behave in a way that's socially acceptable rather than in a way they might otherwise behave. So they're trying to please the experimenter. They want to look like they're a good person. So they go ahead and give answers that are sort of socially acceptable. So like if you ask them about prejudice, they don't want anybody to think that they're prejudiced. So they go ahead and give answers that don't look like they're prejudiced. The solution here, one of the things you could do, is to try to use measures that are more indirect as a dependent variable, or not under the participant's ability to control. These might include things like using a physiological measure or using a reaction time measure, and not telling them again exactly what that dependent variable is, so that they're not likely to go ahead and try to show their social desirability. So social desirability concerns are only really relevant when you've got a kind of experiment where your participants may worry about looking socially acceptable. There's lots of research in psychology where I don't think anybody really cares about how, when you ask them, is the arrow pointing to the right or the left, there isn't some socially acceptable answer for that. But again, asking about prejudice or asking about whether or not they ever lie, these kinds of questions could be things that would cause social desirability concerns to be more relevant, and you might have to find other ways then for your dependent variables to get around that. Okay, so I'm giving you an introduction now to all of these choices that researchers face, the choice of the kind of methodology of doing an experiment and how they choose their sample, how we have to consider what our independent variable is and what our dependent variable is, and then I've gone over threats to internal validity and external validity. Again, at the next lecture, we're going to look at some of these same sorts of questions, but we'll look specifically at survey design, which doesn't seem to have as many of these kinds of problems.